She's beginning, if you'd like to come in.
Okay, we've got one more.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's such a pleasure to see some new faces, and we hope you come back. And there's a contingent here from the Hale House, so we're particularly honored by that. And somebody else who read Man Without a Country in 7th grade and has a big speech memorized. And that's really exciting because we all come with different background here. I'd like to introduce Bob Madison. He's Professor Emeritus of the United States Naval Academy. And I have to cheat here, the Associate General Editor of the Writings of Herman Melville, and also he edited Man Without a Country and other naval writings. So for those of you who came thinking you were going to hear something about Edward Snowden, the Man Without a Country now, you are wrong. You're in the wrong place. But without further ado, it's yours.
Thank you. Yes, I am Ellen's brother, and that's how I'm known in the town of Westerly. So Ellen's brother is very grateful that I have an opportunity to talk to you this summer about two things that I really enjoy a great deal. One is the scholarship of literature of the sea, which we're here tonight to talk about. In July, I'll be back here wearing work clothes talking about how to build a Lionel Christmas layout. So you can come back for that as well. It'll be very different. I think there are 3 short stories in American literature that have worldwide recognition. Astoundingly, 2 of them were written by the same person, Washington Irving. If you mention The Legend of Sleepy Hollow or Rip Van Winkle anywhere in the world, people will recognize a character and at least some element of plot, even if it's only somebody sleeping 20 years or somebody who throws his head and it turns into a pumpkin. That's Irving. The third story that has worldwide recognition is The Man Without a Country. And I suspect that although the majority of English speakers in the world would be very familiar with that phrase, not one of them could tell you really much about the plot of the story or about its characters or about its narrator. So tonight you will learn a little bit about those things and why this story is so famous. Edward Everett Hale is related to the Nathan Hale that we all know and love from Connecticut. Nathan Hale was Edward Everett's great uncle. He was a great-grandnephew on the other way, and I get confused by how those things work. So it wasn't an immediate relative, although Edward Everett Hale's father was named Nathan, and Edward Everett Hale named one of his sons Nathan. So if you say, is he related to Nathan Hale? Yes, of course he is. But he is just fairly closely related to Nathan Hale the Patriot. Edward Everett Hale was born in 1822. 1822 is a little late for that great flowering of American writers that we know from the time of Emerson, who was born in 1803, through the time of Thoreau, who was born in 1817. So just a couple of years later. But these younger guys had a career that lasted into the 20th century. And their life experience was pretty remarkable because it went from a time before regular steamboat travel up through electric lights and whatever else you might want to talk about. Edward Everett Hale began his writing career seriously for the Atlantic Monthly, which itself was an abolition monthly. He ended his career writing for National Geographic, the same National Geographic that you have copies of in your attic. So his career was an astoundingly varied one for a person, and he, as I said, he was fortunate to be just on the youngest edge of that American Renaissance, so that his career spanned all the way through to the 20th century. Autobiographically, Hale died in 1909, a few months after my father was born. Helen said my father was born in 1909. So my father and Edward Everett Hale were contemporaries. That's astonishing as well. It's also curious that at one time my father and his family lived in Matunic, and undoubtedly at some time or another ran into Hales up and down that road, because there weren't that many roads in That's where they lived. That's not why I have an interest in Hale. I have an interest in Hale because he wrote the most famous maritime or nautical short story in American literature. And working at the Naval Academy, it was interesting to follow the course of that story. And it was obviously a good teaching story. And at the Naval Academy, though, it has gone out of favor. And there's something shorter. Everyone uses A Message to Garcia now for teaching duty and patriotism and so forth. And it's only 2 pages long. Man Without a Country is about 22 pages long in most versions. So it's not the didactic tool that it was at the end of Hale's life. It also wasn't a didactic tool when it was first written, although Hale wrote it that way. Hale describes writing The Man Without a Country in one of his late prefaces, and he says, "It was summertime, it was the darkest days of the history of our country." And this was the summer of 1863. I would have thought that the darkest days were the summer of 1862, when we lost all the battles. But by the time he sat down to write this, we had just won the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg. So the tide had turned, although in the summer of 1863, nobody was really sure of that. And in fact, there was an election coming up, and that election would determine whether Congress was populated by those who wanted to continue the war to subdue the South, and they treated the South as rebellious. They called this the Great Rebellion. Or whether the other party would win and there would be some kind of reconciliation and probably a separation of the states into different countries. His initial purpose in writing the story was to try to ensure that the right party won and that all the states would be brought back into the Union under the flag of the United States of America. That was the purpose in the summer of 1863. Its purpose wasn't fulfilled because even though Hale delivered his manuscript on time to the Atlantic Monthly, as things go, they were late and they missed an issue and they missed another issue. And so it was actually published after the election. And by the time the election had taken place, Lincoln had been reelected, but more importantly, Congress had been repopulated with people who wanted to continue the existence of the Union. So the initial purpose was not fulfilled simply because the work wasn't published in time. The work was published first in the Atlantic Monthly, and this is the actual Atlantic Monthly. We have a couple of these here. And I was recently at a presentation that was sponsored by the University of Arkansas in connection with the Remnant Trust. The Remnant Trust provides copies of old and important works, and when I say old, I mean some of this stuff is 2,500 years old, and they hand it around. And I thought, wow, that's great. So you want to be able to handle, okay, this is the first appearance of where the story about Philip Nolan, a young Army lieutenant who's caught up with the shenanigans of Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr is arrested and brought back and tried in Richmond for treason because he wanted to go and annex Texas on his own. And Burr and everybody else got away, but some of these other junior officers out on the Mississippi who still posted out there were implicated. And fictionally, Edward Everett Hale has this young Philip Nolan be one of the associates who's caught up in one of these trials, court-martials. And he's young, he's rash, and so he's brought up to this trial. He's found that he's guilty of partially, I don't know how it could be treasonous to go and try to capture Texas because they were part of Mexico. But anyway, all the big guys got off because of that technicality, but Philip Nolan didn't. So Philip Nolan is found responsible for this activity, and the judge says, do you have anything to say for yourself? And Philip Nolan says, damn the United States, I wish I may never hear her name again. And the judge is one of these Revolutionary War heroes. He's this old coot who was fought in the Revolution. He's really broken up and upset by this. And he decides, okay. And he puts Nolan on a ship. And that's where the rest of the story takes off, because Philip Nolan never sees the United States again, never hears the name of the United States spoken until the day that he dies. And there are many different little episodes that Hale weaves into this story, which have largely to do with the course of naval history, both in its Romantic period, the War of 1812, and following that when the United States Navy was engaged in showing the flag of this new sturdy little republic abroad and in suppressing the slave trade. These are different aspects of maritime history that Hale was very familiar with and wove into his story. During the Civil War, one of the jobs that Hale had was as an assistant to the Army and Navy magazine. And that was a professional magazine. And they would run articles like, oh, we've got to have this more powerful cannon. And the next article would be, no, we've got to have this more powerful ironclad. And they went back and forth, very technical stuff. But as an editor of contemporary naval affairs, of course, Hale was very familiar with a lot of this stuff. He also, he tells us in one of his introductions, apparently had the summer off, so he goes to Worcester, where his previous church had been. Hale's a minister, Unitarian minister. But ministers in those days would leave for the summer like everybody else. Instead of going to the beach this summer, he went to Worcester. Not my first choice. But he went there because the American Antiquarian Society was there. And the American Antiquarian Society is famous because it has, of course there was no other type, but physical copies of all the newspapers that were printed in the United States. And he could go there and he could research the news of the day in 1807 and 1809 and 1820 and so forth. And this is what he did. So he spent his time there. People often ask me, where did Hale write Man Without a Country? Did he write it at Matunic? And there's a complicated answer there. He didn't write it at Matunic, but most of the subsequent introductions that he wrote were written in Matunic. He didn't even write it at Boston. There are two Hale houses, one's in Boston, one's in Matunic. Each of them is a post-war habitation for Hale. So he wasn't really, at this period, he wasn't living in either one of those. He tells us in that late introduction that he went to his family home in Worcester. I don't know if that was a home that he lived in as a kid. When you say family, that implies that. Whether he had kept their house from when he was preaching in Worcester, I just don't know. There is no Hale house in Worcester that identifies itself as such. But he did all the research there, if we can believe this introduction. And I don't see any reason not to at this point. So that's where he did it. Now, whether he was commuting back to Boston, where he lived before he had his Roxbury house, and actually did his writing there, or Worcester, I just don't know. But those were the places that he infused his brain with naval history from 1805, basically, down to the present, and gave him the structure and the background for this story. He made a little mistake. I have used the name Philip Nolan, and he was aware that somewhere out in, he was reading somebody's memoirs from this southwestern history. In those days they called Louisiana the Southwest. And there was this guy who, whenever he couldn't remember something, would say, well, I don't really know, those papers were with Nolan and they got lost. And he thought that that Nolan's name was Stephen. And so he named his Nolan Philip. Actually, he was a preacher. He got the evangelist Stephen and Philip mixed up. And there was a real historical Philip Nolan, which created some problems for him when his book came out, because people would say, this isn't how Philip Nolan died. Philip Nolan died in Texas, and so forth. And they were right. And he actually had to go on in his career and write a whole book about Philip Nolan's friends to straighten up the historical record. Hale wrote history as well as fiction. Hale wrote fiction often, even when he was supposed to be writing history. So this is a question for us. So when I say I'm not sure whether we can believe what American Antiquarian's story or not, I do accept that, but you've got to be very careful, because he might say, I did this then, or I did that then. And it's a literary pose. In fact, the narrator of this story, as well as many other stories, is a guy named Frederick Ingham. And in some of the stories, Frederick Ingham is a captain, United States Navy. And in others, he's colonel, United States Army. And any of you who have had military service know you don't do that. You don't make captain and then just get colonel and start. It just doesn't happen. So this is a fictional persona, but it allowed him to tell a lot of stories. Most of the stories that Frederick Ingham appears in are humor. They're funny stories. And there are some other Civil War stories that feature Frederick Ingham and fit right in with this man without a country stuff, but it's not so serious. It's very much a humorous proposition. One of those stories is The Last of the Florida. The Florida was a Confederate commerce raider. And if you know your Civil War maritime history, which nobody really does because we had all these great battles, but the Florida was in Brazil, so was an American cruiser. That's an international port, right? You can't just go fight your enemy, but they did. And the Union vessel captured the Florida and took her off. It was a huge international incident. They had to give it back. In Hale's story version of that, which is pure fiction, guess who the captain is who's assigned to bring the Florida back to Brazil? Well, of course, it's Frederick Ingham. And it's amazing how much trouble he has getting back. And the letters that he sends are, well, you know, we have to go here because this coaling station is not open. So it's 1863. Well, we have to go here because that coaling station really wasn't good and the weather looked bad here. 1864. Well, it's like 1869 before these letters start. The ship is never returned to active service. Now, it's totally fictional. Totally fictional. But it shows us another side of Frederick Ingham. Frederick Ingham's last story is called The Palatine. Did he write it in Matunic? Yes, he did. They're all sitting around at the Hale house. And at this time, the narrator of their story is Hale himself. And his friend, Frederick Ingham, is there. And Frederick Ingham, at this point, kind of transposes into William Babcock Whedon, who was the guy who lived across the street and incidentally provided Hale with his house. But Frederick Ingham kept a boat on the beach at Matunic. This is fairly common. Block Island cowhorn, little double ender, very small schooner. You rolled it into the surf on logs and you went out. Well, they're all sitting around the porch one night and they see a light and they think it's the Fall River steamer. Looks like it's on fire. It isn't, of course, so they go out, all go down to the beach. Ingham pushes the boat in the water. He and a couple of guys go out to save presumably people on the burning Fall River steamer. Turns out it was the Palatine. Ingham has never seen again, never appears in a story again. So that's how Hale got rid of this particular alter ego, was in one of these stories. And these are all in my book. They're all in the Classics of Naval Literature edition of Men Without a Country, along with some naval history that's pointed towards children. He couldn't really make up his mind whether he was writing for an adult audience. The Atlantic Monthly is a very serious adult audience. And yet, shortly after the war, Men Without a Country gets more and more to be pitched to kids as a kind of a patriotic textbook. I don't know how successful Man Without a Country was when it was published in the 1863 Atlantic Monthly. Hale says that there were millions of copies and it was distributed widely without any attention paid to the copyright or whatever. There's no evidence to support that. It could have been that Men Without a Country was just published as pamphlets, ripped off, or published in newspapers and whatever, but I've never seen any of those. Now that doesn't mean they didn't exist. But if they were published in the millions, or 500,000 even, you probably would have found some evidence, if not in what was for sale, in things like the National Union Catalog, which try to list all the publications of these people. And so that just isn't borne out that this was printed widely without regard to copyright. That's one of the first statements that make you really think about what actually is going on with this guy in terms of his veracity as a narrator in what's supposed to be true. And we're going to encounter some more of that as we go through some of these editions. Whatever the case, at the end of the war, 1865, there was enough of recognition of this story that Ticknor and Fields did publish it as a pamphlet, and I have no idea what it cost, probably a quarter in those days. Nowadays, $400 to $800 will get you one of these. I looked online today and the price was unfortunately down since I bought mine. But it depends on condition and that sort of thing too. But this is the first edition of The Man Without a Country. Booksellers say that to distinguish the first independent book printing from something like a magazine appearance. So there it is, 1865, and it also appeared almost simultaneously in a collection that the editors of the Atlantic Monthly put out called Atlantic Tales. Now this book was probably set in stereotype plates, so they could print thousands of copies for this without worrying about individual pieces of type. There was an entire plate for each page. There's another version of this book called Classic Modern Stories that was published in Philadelphia. Same book, different title. Maybe that is the origin of why Hale said that they were publishing this without regard to the copyright. I don't know. It's 1866 for this edition. It was copyright 1865, the same year the little pamphlet came out. And Atlantic Tales has 2 stories by Hale. It also has a whole bunch of stories by some other people in it. The most famous story written by Hale at this time was a piece called My Double and How He Undid Me. Nobody ever hears of it today, and it's not really worth reading. It's part of a 19th century kind of very light humor that is insubstantial. And when I say something like that, why wouldn't it be worth reading? Yeah, it's cute. One of the ways to judge great literature is by asking yourself, what am I thinking about after you read it? And after you read My Double and How He Undid Me, you're saying, ha ha, let's have some ice cream. And after you read Man Without a Country, you're saying, whoa, no, this is pretty serious. I mean, and there's lots of different issues that you might be troubled by. One of my friends was enormously troubled by how callous the Navy was in keeping records about this guy who was transferred from ship to ship and never allowed to come back. Even after, as the story tells us, he had taken the place of one of the captains of the guns in a frigate battle and helped to win one of the important frigate battles of the War of 1812. And different captains went on record as trying to get his pardon. Washington, D.C. just ignored the whole issue. And that was enormously troubling to a friend of mine. But this is an issue or a theme that we tend to end up thinking about. The last story in this volume is The Man Without a Country. So it begins with a piece of fluff and ends with this enormously famous short story. I don't think there's any other short story in here that you would know. You would have to be a student of American literature to recognize even some of the names. One story is by his sister, Lucretia P. Hale. The only name I think that you might know here is somebody named Charles Nordhoff. You hear of Nordhoff and Hall. And I think this was Nordhoff, the father of the Bounty Nordhoff. But there it was. It came out. And even when Hale got his own collection of short stories in a book called If, Yes, and Perhaps, oh, Mr. Hale, is that story really true? Perhaps. If, yes, no. So, 4 possibilities and 6 exaggerations is what he calls his own collection of stories. And once again, Man Without a Country is just buried 2/3 of the way through. There's no particular recognition that this is a great story or that he has become a great writer. Although by this time, he had written so much for the Atlantic Monthly that he is regarded as one of the stable contributors to American letters. Remember that Henry Thoreau had died in 1863 during the war. Nathaniel Hawthorne had died during the war, 1864. Those were serious blows to American literature, to us today as we look backwards. But at the time, there were so many good writers in New England. Thoreau's death, hardly anybody noticed it. And then, of course, Emerson and Longfellow just lived forever. They lived till 1882, 1883, both of them probably senile. It's said that Emerson visited or took part in the service for Longfellow, and Emerson said, "He was a great poet, but I can't remember his name." That, unfortunately, has been quoted with a slightly different spin to say that Longfellow was not a great poet. Nowadays, people look back at Longfellow, well, he was pretty good once we pay attention to form and so forth. But Hale was just one of the stable of notable writers. Another one who was very similar to him in many ways was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Higginson was also a Unitarian preacher in Worcester. Higginson was also an abolitionist. Higginson, unlike Hale, Higginson actually did go to war and went as colonel of the 2nd Black Regiment to be formed of freed slaves in South Carolina. And he had some adventures to tell, and he told them in the Atlantic Monthly, and after the war, he also was famous. He probably had the edge in terms of the hotness factor because he had been a soldier and Hale hadn't. Ironically, though, we think of Higginson today because some poet in Amherst sent him a couple of poems and said, "Do you have time to say whether my poems live?" And of course they did, and it was Emily Dickinson. In the 1850s, Emily Dickinson had been writing to Hale because Hale was the preacher for one of her friends who had died, and she was concerned with his soul, and she writes this letter. And you know Emily Dickinson. "Sir, do you have time to tell me whether my friend died in peace or was ready to die? And he mentioned God, but I'm not sure it was the right God," and so forth. So her letters are pretty interesting to Hale then. And I don't know very much about those letters to Hale because she didn't follow up. I think she had an absolute crush on Higginson, and I don't think Hale was out of the pale on that either. New England was a pretty small place, and people would actually have seen other people, even if they didn't know them closely, but they all knew each other by reputation, and all the families did. So anyway, that was his little episode with Emily. But after the war, at least as far as I know, there was no more contact between Emily Dickinson and Hale. And the militant abolitionist Higginson went on to a career almost identical to Hale's in terms of writing, except that he did have that war experience, and he was always a little more energetic. He went on to champion women's rights and outdoor exercise and that sort of thing. Whereas Hale seemed to continue this literary existence in a pretty straightforward way. And sometime around 1873, a few years after the war ended, his friend Whedon, who had been a captain, member of artillery, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery, Battery C, built him the house down in Matunic. So he became a fixture, or a regular fixture, as far as his duties as minister in Boston would allow, which, as I said, these preachers took all summer off. They didn't care. So he had that going for him, and it was at about that time as well that The Man Without a Country seemed to get some recognition as something other than a piece that was just for the downtime of the Civil War. And this is when people began to recognize there was some really central lesson here, and that this piece, of all the things that had been written in the war, had a lasting value that some other writings probably didn't have. So the next collection that we see of Edward Everett Hale, which actually uses some of the same stereotype plates as If, Yes, and Perhaps, now The Man Without a Country is the first story, and the name of the collection is The Man Without a Country, and let me get this exactly right, and other tales. So the rest of his corpus has been set aside. Now this is a guy who's going to write like 100 books. So it's not like he stopped writing, but this tale around 1870-73 in that area, this book was copyright 1868 because that's when the plates were made. This particular issue of it is 1882. So in those years, he is going to become known as the man who wrote The Man Without a Country. This is sort of a turn of a century collection, same plates again, 1888, 1868, but this binding tells us that this was actually printed a lot later than that. This is a sort of a colorful binding of the 90s. And after we speak, you can come up and handle and look at all of these other versions as well. Once people started saying, we want more copies of this, of course, besides it being in his collections, they started printing individual copies. And his publisher would say, hey, can you write me a new paragraph or a new introduction for this book, because I want it to be something special. Well, when he collected his short stories the first time, he wrote an introduction. The pamphlet, the Atlantic Monthly version, has no introduction. So 1868, he sits down, he writes an introduction. And that introduction, as basic boilerplate, he would use right down until almost the year that he died, as he wrote new introductions for these different books. And he'd add, at the least, he would add a sentence, and at the most, he might write a whole extensive several pages on introducing the book. But for the most part, he's just tinkering with the boilerplate. The most egregious example comes, this is a nice little copy of the book. It's The Man Without a Country and Its History. So if you're just going to go out and you're going to buy one of these books, this is a nice copy to have. You'll notice that the front free end paper, somebody tore it out of this. Why do you suppose they did that? Well, it was a numbered limited edition signed by the author, and some book vandal has torn out the page with his autograph on it and sold it separately. These are not expensive. These are under $100. You could have a signed Everett Hale book. But in this one, this is a very special limited edition, and he says, the publisher of this edition of The Man Without a Country asks me to give some account of the circumstances and incidents of its publication. This is 1897 he's writing this. And this happens to be the best overall introduction. It's got the most really interesting, reliable information that we can have. All the rest of it had been kind of, oh, it was the middle of the war and we were going to wave the flag and all that kind of stuff, which doesn't really tell us much about the writing. Here, he goes into a lot more background and says, well, you know, when I was a kid and I was reading Scott's Life of Napoleon, if you read the first quarter of Scott's Life of Napoleon is a history of the French Revolution. And you could see why the English were so scared that this kind of thinking was going to come to their island, was scared to death. Well, at the end of Scott's Napoleon, Scott reports how Napoleon surrenders to the captain of the Bellerophon, or the Billy Ruffian, as the English called that ship. So he surrendered, and he surrenders. And afterwards, when they were going to send him to St. Helena, he says, whoa, 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 I didn't surrender to Great Britain, I surrendered to the captain of the Billy Ruffian. And Hale makes a great deal of fun about that. And Hale says, you know, in my mind then I thought, well, why didn't they just give him his word and keep him sailing around the world on the Billy Ruffian until he died, and then he'd have no place to go. Instead, they send him to St. Helena, and St. Helena becomes a French shrine. Those were his words. And he explains, well, we get a lot more of information like that about how he actually wrote the story. And it's from this introduction that we're told about the American Antiquarian Society and the newspaper and how he spent that summer writing the story. But he also tells us some very interesting things. 1897. 97 minus 22 is 75. Okay? Now, I don't know what his mindset is like. I know he continued to preach to the end of the century, so a couple of years more. And then he became chaplain, that's the word, chaplain to the United States Senate. And somebody says, when you are in Washington, do you pray for the senators? And Hale says, no, when I'm in Washington, I look at the senators and I pray for the country. So I like that story. So, but also in this introduction, he says some other things about how he wrote this book. And he says, for instance, that it was obviously a fiction all along, because at the end of this story, when we get a letter that reports Philip Nolan's death, it's set on top of the Andes. So anybody in his right mind would know that only somebody who is writing a deliberate fiction would have a ship on top of the Andes. There's no edition anywhere where the ship is set on top of the Andes. Why would Hale say that? Not this edition, not any other edition. It's always 3 degrees south latitude, 131 degrees west longitude, which puts it out almost on the equator, almost due south of Hawaii. Why would he? And it's not like this is a slip of a pen. He goes on, it's a whole half a paragraph about how he set this, and the ship was on the Andes, and it just isn't true. Another place in that introduction, he talks about how he referred to a ship as a felucca. Philip Nolan is assisting in the suppression of the slave trade, and their sloop of war encounters a schooner full of slaves. And the word schooner appears a couple of times. And the first edition has schooner, and the Atlantic Monthly has schooner. And in that introduction, he says, well, when I first wrote this, I said felucca, but in the later editions, I've corrected that to schooner. It was never wrong. It was never wrong. He never used the wrong word for this. So I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what. And of course, that undercuts some of your trust in some of the other things that he is saying. So I just don't know what's going on. There are other things that are kind of curious about these books. When I first got this book, this is a very late edition. This is from February 15th, 1909, almost exactly a month before my father was born. My dear Conrad, I hope you will never live to see such a crisis as brought this book into being. Edward Everett Hale. Oh, that's really nice, isn't it? I mean, that's an important sentiment. You want to know who this Conrad was. The same sentence appears in his introduction. I hope no one ever lives to see such a crisis as it. So it was just something that he wrote in the books when he signed them for other people. This one is, I think, a little more honest. K.B. Codman from E.E. Hale, 227 Beacon Street. Miss K.B. Codman, wrote about the Chelsea fire and Charities and the Commons. So he would give these away. There are a lot of books that he signed. There was it was a series of books that he published by the Lend a Hand Society, and he just put E.E. Hale on the copy of every single one. So signature is not particularly rare. If you need an Edward Everett Hale signature to take home with you, we have an extra one here. That's what happens to all of these things. They get cut up because the signature alone is worth more than the value of the book. By the end of his life, and by the end of his life, the last decade of his life, from the Spanish-American War on, this tale was by now mythological. And its application during the Spanish-American War was almost vilely jingoistic. Love your country, hate the Spanish. Yep, now you can see the cruelty of the Spanish here. We should have taken care of the Spanish. You know, when Philip Nolan tried to take Texas away from it, it's just really, and it enters some of the introductions of these books. There's actually, I think it's a footnote that says, see, we should have taken care of the Spaniards 100 years ago and we didn't, and now we're doing it. And it's like, whoa, from our point of view now, 100 years after the Spanish-American War, hey, that's not one of our best moments. So but he got caught up in it, the country was caught up into it, And Man Without a Country became almost a Bible for that kind of imperialistic, jingoistic stuff. It did not stop after Hale died in 1909. All of the little books on the back row are basically textbooks for usually high school, but occasionally someone else. This one has a little stamp in the top. It says Department of English, U.S. Naval Academy, Annapolis, Maryland. And it has another stamp underneath it that says H.C. Washburn. And he was one of the teachers. They named a building after him. So apparently he stamped it first, then the Naval Academy stamped it. And fortunately for us, they dated this book, August 29th, 1914. What's your favorite Barbara Tuchman book? The Guns of August. This was a textbook issued to midshipmen August of 1914 as the First World War begins. And this is what you're expected to read. I'm proud to say that the only notes in this book are apparently from a colleague of mine, Wilson Heflin, who also taught literature of the sea at the Naval Academy. The students didn't write anything in it. Sometimes when you find a book at the Naval Academy, the introduction will be just in tatters. This was true with Higginson's Enchiridion, actually. And the stuff that said, okay, this is what the book is about, was just in tatters, and the rest of the book hadn't been cracked. So, okay. They had some trouble. The rest of these come not down to the present, because as I said, now in most educational settings, I think this book has been replaced by something like Message to Garcia, where the emphasis is on your individual sense of duty rather than referentially to the country itself in a kind of patriotic way. So it is your duty to yourself to become this great kind of achieving person, not just because, as was the total lesson of this book, you are born in the bosom of the state protects you, the state nurtures you, and you owe them a duty. But we do see that the book, as a separate book, was enormously popular through the first half of the 20th century. And I know that some of us here encountered this book, usually in junior high school. And some of these books that did belong to a public school setting, you don't want to start looking at the markings that they're in them. It's like, oh, I'm bored today, why do I have to read this book? 'Cause kids haven't changed. There's one cute one, let me see if I can find it here. If my name you wish to see, look on page, but it was supposed to be like a 3-4 syllable word, like 123. And so he wrote that, but then he realized there's only 40 pages in the book. So the stupid kid had to cross it out and write in 23, which doesn't fit his meter anymore. And of course you go to 23. Now you have taken the trouble to look on the page in the back of the book. So you go to the back of the book and it's his notes on iambic pentameter and so forth from another class. But he wrote them in his copy of Man Without a Country. So anyway, we have, if you're familiar with old textbooks that get turned into the school again, you've seen this kind of thing going on. Harry Peterson seems to be the name that fits that. So, one little exception to the main course of this book as a patriotic literature is this little tiny thing. It's obviously it's a yellow book, but it's called The Little Blue Book, number 277, edited by E. Haldeman Julius, The Man Without a Country, Edward Everett Hale. Haldeman Julius was an independent publisher in Kansas. And as hard as this may seem to be, there were places in Arkansas and Kansas that were actually pockets of the most extreme liberalism you could imagine. And not anymore, but then, again, before World War II they were. And this guy was one of them. And he published all kinds of stuff, but most of it had a decidedly liberal or populistic kind of bent to it, trying to make the great knowledge of the world accessible to the ordinary person. And this is one that he picked up and that he published. And of course, there's no introduction at all. There's no spin in this whatsoever. He just presented the text of it. This would be a case of where the copyright of Man Without a Country was violated if it was still in copyright 25 years after Hale's death. And I'm not exactly sure how those things work. Copyright law changes from time to time, and most of my work was done when anything before like 1924 was fair game, anything at all. So, and that was changed because apparently Mickey Mouse was coming to go out of copyright, and so there was a big lobby that extended or modified the laws. I hope that you will come up here and just look at any of these books. Everything is handleable. It's not as fragile as you might expect. So you can actually open these, look at the illustrations. One of the things I haven't even begun to talk about is the way that The Man Without a Country is reimagined into art. And there's a good illustration of book manufacture and book art at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the, the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when books really did get beautiful. These are not in great condition, some of them, but they do give you a sense of where the book art was going. And by the end of this period, of course, Man Without a Country, name everybody recognizes, and for people who read it, presumably right up through about 1960, was something that everybody read, and everybody would actually have known the plot of this, unlike today. Thank you very much. That is the end of our formal presentation.
Bob's happy to entertain questions. Do you have questions for him?
Yes.
How easy was it for Hale to have this book published in the first place?
Hale went to Harvard. He was the son of a newspaper editor, and he went to Harvard, where his genius as a writer was recognized early. So he began writing formally for publication as a fairly young man. He also got a good pulpit gig in Worcester, and then an even better one in Boston. So he was secure financially from the get-go, and then had all of this writing stuff was just gravy. And he had the right connections. If your father's a newspaper man in Boston, you're going to be part of the literary circles. So not as hard as it would be today. Yes?
Would he know Melville, who was younger?
He would have known Melville from Melville's book Typee, published in 1846, which nearly everybody did. But he would not necessarily have been familiar with the later writings of Herman Melville. The most important review of Herman Melville, as it affects our guy, Hale, was in, I think, 1867, and it was written by Silas Lapham, William Dean Howells. And William Dean Howells became editor of The Atlantic, and he wrote this really nasty, dismissive review of Herman Melville's Civil War poetry, which today we think of as like the second best Civil War poetry. And almost certainly Hale will have read that review, but I don't know if he was influenced by that. There's no other link that I can see between those, and there's no allusion in Melville anywhere that he read Man Without a Country. Melville was tuned into Harper's and Putnam's magazines in New York. So that he really was, even though he summered in Pittsfield and lived there at the time that he wrote Moby Dick, he was a New Yorker. And Hale was preeminently a New Englander. Yes?
How did you happen to focus on Hale and something you always wanted to do, or how did it happen?
No, Classics of Naval Literature is a series of books. The overall editor was a history prof named Jack Sweetman. And Jack developed this series to get back into nice editions, Classics of Naval Literature of all kinds. And I did several of those for them, which meant that we had to find a good text, clean it up, write a scholarly introduction that was nevertheless accessible to common, ordinary sailor readers, pretty much officers. And they did a beautiful job with these books in terms of the paper and the binding and everything else. And I had done Porter's Journal. Porter's Journal was, David Porter. And as Hale says here, the old Porter, not the Civil War Porter, Essex Porter. And then he says, not this Essex, but the old Essex. The old Essex was a ship during the War of 1812. It was the first American vessel to wage war in the Pacific. And the guy who was the captain wrote a brilliant book that he came back and published in 1815. And it was wonderfully, 1815 is a pretty important year in publishing because it was right about then that everybody started worrying about impurities in print. Before that, not so much. I mean, you've read Tom Jones. After that, that's the era, you know, of the sleeves on the legs of the tables so that you don't see the naked limb. His first edition is pretty funny. Porter's ship gets to the Marquesas Islands, and the local tribe enlists his sailors to go fight the guys in the next valley. They haul their artillery, try to get it up this mountain. The guys in the next valley laugh at them. They actually turn around and moon them. And Porter describes all this. And of course, the British press just jumps all over him for it. In 1822, Porter writes a long rejoinder, but the edition that's appended to is all cleaned up. All that stuff is taken out. So 1822 had to be clean. 1815 didn't have to be. In Men Without a Country, Hale says that Porter should have left Philip Nolan on the Marquesas Island to claim them for America. So Hale interacts with these guys. Well, Porter's Journal was the first one that I published, that I did for Classics of Naval Literature. I did The Life of Nelson for them by Robert Southey, which is another English romantic classic book. And this was either the third or fourth one that I did with them. So it was just something that came along. And after a while, we ran out of stuff because how many classics of naval literature are there? You know, not many. So I asked Jack, I said, how many of these are you going to publish? And he says, we're going to keep publishing as long as they let us. So this one was sort of a manufactured volume. But I had become aware that Hale had this other naval collection. And there was enough good naval stuff that you could put in a nice volume and sell it to sailors. So that's sort of how it happened. Just before we left Annapolis, there was a lieutenant colonel of Marines who was putting together a textbook for midshipmen, and he was looking for material to put in. I had a whole stack of material that I thought should have been put into a leadership book. So about a quarter of the submissions in that volume, which Karen and I edited together, proofread together, are ones that I selected and introduced. And Men Without a Country is a natural for that kind of book. It's a short story that teaches you. And it was naval. It was so thoroughly naval. It was great. Other ones are something like the last chapter of Robert Falcon Scott's book, which he didn't get to publish it himself. How come? Because he died. So the last chapter is his letter that they find on his frozen body that says that Britain will take good care of my wife. And she says, you know, we didn't make any mistakes. We just had hard luck and now we're dead. So these are things that we hoped would inspire midshipmen, not just for this bland patriotic reason, but so that they could really examine some of the ways that things turn out. Sometimes you die, sometimes it's fictional, and sometimes it's real, and we had a lot of these stories. So they all went into a book on leadership that was published. So that was another place that I actually was editing Man Without a Country. And this stuff is all gathered together because I'd hoped to actually do an edition for the 150th anniversary of it, which we're right in the middle of now. Last December marks its serial publication, and next year will mark its independent book publication, but I'm never going to do it. The problem wasn't just ascertaining any differences there were in the text. And you know, he claims that he made corrections. I don't see them. I don't see any. But you have to read them against each other word for word. But then this whole problem of the introductions was insurmountable because there's so much that is identical, but then he'll go off on a tangent or whatever. And I just didn't figure out how to include that, and I still don't know. So, and it's not something that I have a publisher for or that somebody's jumping on me to do, so it just remains undone. So if any of you wants a retirement project, I will set you up and tell you exactly what you can do with these. Well, you guys just did that prize-winning Granite book, so I guess it's, yeah. Oh, you read her dissertation? Oh, yes.
So, are there any papers in any libraries, any drafts?
The normal place that you would look for the manuscript of Men Without a Country would be Harvard, who has everything, and it doesn't exist, and nobody's claimed to have it. It would be a great find, yes. And when you find it, and this will probably turn up at the Hale house, because they're the ones who turn up these papers. They'll be going through a box of stuff that somebody's donated, and here will be this manuscript for The Man Without a Country.
I understand that you said he was a Unitarian.
Yes,
But wasn't his church in Boston a congregational?
I think so.
And was there for 43 years?
Yes.
So why is he not
Don't
a Unitarian?
ask me. Don't ask me. But remember that how the Unitarian's a brand new church, 1830s, right? 1837 or whatever. So they're really, who are they? Those are those wild liberal Congregationalists, as opposed to everybody else who's Congregationalist. Ironically, in Man Without a Country, the Psalter that Philip Nolan has is part Presbyterian and part Episcopalian. And I don't know if that's Hale playing with this idea or not, because you go to church, you reach in the pew, it's not going to be half Presbyterian and half Episcopalian. It doesn't work that way. But this is just another one of those things. I can't answer that.
And is there a house in Boston to visit?
Yes, but it was, I think it's from 1869, and at the very end of Hale's living there, it was like moved around a corner or something. So it's not exactly in the same place they lived there most of the time.
Is it downtown?
Like that I can't tell you. Roxbury, I think. Do you know exactly where the Boston Hale house is?
39 Highland Street.
There you go.
It's privately owned, it's not open.
Oh, it is.
What influence did the Whedon family have on him?
They supported him. No, but this guy, I mean, he's one of the most famous preachers in Boston, and he has this literary career. So I don't know why somebody has to buy him a summer house. Do you know why? He would just, I mean, he obviously had a great affection for this guy and a great appreciation for him. But I don't know how they met. How did the Whedons meet the...
Largely through the Unitarian Church. They were both very interested in a lot of what we would now call social action.
Mm-hmm.
Every reform movement you can imagine that was going on in the 1860s, they were both very much involved. And they were both amateur and to some degree professional historians as well. They knew each other through all of these common interests. Whedon had inherited a portion of the farm in Mattoon, which is still in the Whedon family, and bought out his siblings and made that his summer home. Came down from Providence and spent the summers there. And with all due respect to his neighbors, the farmers of Mattoon couldn't carry on the same kind of conversations with him that his friend Hale could. So he began inviting Hale to come down to spend summers with him, with his family. When both families had small children. And the farmhouse, which is still standing, must have seemed like it was shrinking after a while as all of these kids got older and bigger and more rambunctious. So we essentially said, okay, I'll build a guest house for you up on the hill. This was 1873, and the family used it until Edward's sister Susan's death in 1910, just over 35 years.
Sister Susan's book about living in Mattoon and many other places as well. Letters of Susan Hale. Did they Did the Hale family ever own it outright?
No.
And that's something I noticed reviewing stuff today, is that someplace it says that they owned it, and I thought I'd remembered you guys saying, no, he never actually owned it. So that might be a way that Whedon covered himself. But still, it was a tremendously expensive and nice gesture to somebody who probably didn't need it.
Whedon had money.
Yeah. Was he president of the Board of Trade or something in Providence or something? Some kind of stuff.
Textile plants.
Yeah.
He could afford it, probably better
Mm-hmm.
than Hale could.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was just thinking generally when you look at all these beautiful artifacts, how we feel about today, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, what are they going to do? Say, oh, it was first appeared online. The first Kindle edition was, it just doesn't seem like it's going to have the
That stuff's going to be gone, and in editing, everybody wants you to send copy and electronically and do this and do that. And the lack of permanence, especially for somebody, if I'm editing, if I read a book and I say this word is wrong and I correct it, the chances that that reverts to some corrupt reading are very high, because people are lazy, people cheat, they don't want to work with my file, they want to start working with somebody else's file, and so everything is corrupt. Stuff corrupts much faster online than it does in print. Now, there's obviously going to be print's corruption. In my Classic of Naval Literature edition of Man Without a Country, at one point, when Hale has just helped out at that cannon that I talked to you about, he sits down on the carriage after the battle. Now the carriage is the wooden structure that holds the bronze tube. And somebody in reading the Classics of Naval Literature edition put in that he sat in the carriage after the battle. They hadn't been reading along, they just saw that and they went with what was idiomatic to them. He had to sit in the carriage, and no, it's not a terrible thing, but you do that for 150 years and you're going to have an accumulated bunch of errors. So if you really wanted to know the best text of Man Without a Country, you probably wouldn't use a book that was published in 1945. You would go back and you would look at that first Atlantic Monthly, and then you would compare it to every edition that Hale had a hand in to see if he made any changes that are authorial, and then you have to consider what to do with them. He claimed that he changed felucca to schooner. He didn't. There never was any edition that had that. So where did that occur? He implies that it occurred in the early editions. He doesn't imply it, he states it. Now, if that is a true story, it must have happened in manuscript. But he says it was some admiral that told him that. So he had to have shown that to somebody who was an admiral. Who could he have shown it to that was an admiral in 1862? There were only two admirals, right? Porter and Farragut. The third one was Shubrick. Shubrick as a name occurs in one of these books, but it's not, the admiral that he names is not one of those three possibilities. So if there's only three admirals during the Civil War, then obviously this happened long after these first editions had come out and the story's false. But that's the kind of stuff you would look for. But that kind of corruption or whatever is going to take place much faster online. Many of the books that we have available to us for free come from Project Gutenberg, which was started about 30 years ago. As soon as there was an internet, people started digitizing text. And they would hire a bunch of graduate students who would sit down and they would type in the text. These are horrible texts. These are just horrible because nobody checked them, nobody proofread them, nobody really edited them. These weren't professional compositors like the people who had been setting books for, say, the Riverside Press for 200 years. And maybe there was some guy who lasted 200 years and did that. I remember the first time that a friend of mine went to the American Antiquarian Society, he was shown not just the reading room area, but he was going to volunteer. So they took him down into all of these vaults and secret places where these newspapers were and these old books were and this was. And my friend said to his guide, "Man, you've got everything here but the Hunchback." Well, his friend just died because one of the curators was actually so they actually had a hunchback in there. And but what the story, I'm using that to illustrate, is that you really do have people who spend their lives with the attention to the detail of manufacturing a book, and that includes being able to typeset it correctly. And that's lost too. Now, if you publish a book, you're expected to provide the electronic copy. How do you do that? I'm not a book artist. All of Hale's children, not with all of them, many of them were involved with art themselves. Okay, they're going to design a book. Okay? How am I going to come up with something like that? Whoops. I just destroyed your clip. We're still on. How am I going to compete? Now you can't see this because the gilding is coming off, but this is one of the beautiful books from around the turn of the century where they would put all of this art into just the cover. It's just gorgeous stuff. And if you go to the title page, as long as it's not a cheap reprint, you'll see all kinds of floral decoration and multicolored inks and so forth. And we can do that today. We can do that with computers as well. But for most of the history of the book, you didn't get that. You got it when books were written by hand, manuscript, right? So that was manuscript illumination. And then you got it around 1900, which was really the end of the individual book publication as we know it. And then things get mass produced by steam presses, and the paperback reigns triumphant. Obviously, this is a paperback from 1865. Most people who got something in paperback in 1865 are going to take it right down to the binder and get it bound. Most of the time when you see an Atlantic Monthly today, it's a big fat volume with all 12 months in it because somebody took it down to the binder and had it bound up. But most of these copies that you see are actually commercially bound. But you don't see here the Signet Classic, Man Without a Country. You don't see the Avon books, Man Without a Country. This was extraordinarily rare to find Man Without a Country, perfect condition, probably undistributed. It was probably never sold, but came from Haldeman Julius's archive. But that, as a paperback from the 20s or 30s, that's extraordinarily amazing that that would survive. Whenever you see an old book advertised in wraps, that means the condition is much better than you would expect for that book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.